Daniel Alan Bey, a journalist based in Beijing. You've been there a little over for a year and a half now. You've done work for Telesur and Ripley as well. Let's focus on the last few months of your experience. What was it like to be in Beijing during quarantine, and what is the latest update from your vantage point?
Yeah, so I've been in Beijing for the entirety of the time, apart from 1 week I spent in Hong Kong at the end of January. So when I left Beijing, it was around the time that Xi Jinping, the General Secretary of the Communist Party here, had identified the coronavirus as basically a national emergency. So that happened as I was on my way to Hong Kong. So before I left, everything was kind of still up in the air. By the time I returned, Beijing was a different place, I would say. And that happened in the space of a week. So I actually arrived back in Beijing at the end of January. So I've been here since then. I had to spend 2 weeks, 14 days in quarantine in my apartment because I'd been traveling. Right now, if you're not from China, you can't get into the country. There's actually a general lockdown on foreign nationals traveling into the country, unless for specific purposes. So it's actually difficult to get in. At the time, I was put into quarantine for 14 days, but it was a self-quarantine. So I actually quarantined in my apartment just for 14 days. And then I was able to go back to work. So yeah, in terms of my experience here, though, I would actually argue, Hubei province has been in a full lockdown up until last week, whereas Beijing I'd describe as being in a partial lockdown or a semi-lockdown. So some things have still been open. Obviously, a lot of businesses closed, a lot of shopping malls closed. The streets were dead for a long time. Most people were, I think, happy to be in quarantine. They self-quarantined at home. In terms of the general kind of mobilization here of kind of state workers and volunteers and so on and so forth, that's been very, very, very visible. So in my community, for example, just to get into my community, I was given a pass. So the pass proves that I live in that residential area. And there are people who belong to the local kind of neighborhood committee who are manning checkpoints, basically, which have been introduced at the entrance of the street I live on. So they check my temperature every single day when I go in and out of the community. They check I've got a pass and I live there.
What do you mean by neighborhood committee, by the way? Just because I don't think anyone in the U.S. has an understanding of what that means.
Yeah, so, the Chinese political system is I think it's misunderstood, to say the least, to put it lightly. Obviously, the Communist Party is led by General Secretary Xi Jinping and the Politburo Standing Committee, who are the 7 most powerful people in China. It then has a Politburo of 25 members. But it's a party of more than 90 million people, which is, there are more people in the Chinese Communist Party than there are in Germany. So within that, it goes right down to a grassroots level, to a provincial level, to a sub-provincial level, a township level, a city level, and then all the way down to a neighborhood level, into schools, into rural areas, into kind of universities, and also into neighborhoods too. So my neighborhood committee is basically, it's a community, basically a community branch that looks after the local neighborhood. So if you have a problem, you can go to them with kind of any problems you have. They also check everything's stable and okay. And they played a really important part, though, in epidemic control in China, or pandemic control now, I should say. Like I said, by checking people's temperatures, by making sure people are not gathering in large groups in the neighborhood, by making sure people are quarantining if they have to, and just overseeing the general kind of control on a very, very micro level. So yeah, some of the people in the neighborhood committee will be in the Communist Party. Others are just volunteers, older people who have lived in this neighborhood, who are from this community, who have spent their lives here. It's a combination of both. But basically, they're a go-to point for problems people have in the local area. And they've played a really, really important part across China, certainly in Beijing, in every neighborhood. So they're a visible presence that you're able to communicate with, and they're there, they're visible. They're, when I leave my apartment today, I will pass through them, and when I come back later, I will also, I will pass through them again. And if I have any questions or problems or issues, they're a group of people I can go to with any kind of concerns I have.
I'm curious, Daniel, because in the U.S. there's been a huge effort to basically blame China for the outbreak of coronavirus, COVID-19. I don't know if you saw, but recently in U.S. media there were reports that it came from this lab. And there's just been an entire preoccupation with where this originated from before there's even a conversation about who has the wisest policy in terms of confronting it. I'm wondering, are people in China blaming anyone in particular for the outbreak of COVID-19? What is the general sense you get from the average Chinese person? What is their perspective of the virus when you walk the streets of Beijing?
Yeah, so I can only speak from my own experience. Like I said, I'm in Beijing, and I haven't, my experience in China is very much Beijing centric. But I mean, yeah. So in January at the beginning, there was some anger in China, especially on social media, at what had happened. Especially with Li Wenliang, the doctor. I feel like people are operating in a different paradigm. So there was criticism of how China responded to the virus at first in China, but this wasn't necessarily anti-party or anti-Chinese government. In many ways, it's just there's a realization that it's not a perfect political system, and people within the system, people within the Communist Party, both at the top and at a much smaller level, realize that, which is why the Communist Party for decades, actually since its inception, has promoted policies of experimentation. They often introduce pilot schemes around the country. If they're successful, they'll expand them. If they're not, they'll can them. So in terms of the response within China, like I said, in January there was a very visible criticism on Chinese social media of how the response had been for a few key weeks. But that, like I said, that wasn't necessarily. I feel like in the West, in a lot of Western media, it was interpreted and reported as a kind of a Chernobyl moment for the Chinese Communist Party. Chernobyl obviously being one of the triggers which led to the collapse of the former Soviet Union. I didn't get that sense here. Some of my friends and colleagues and people I know, they were critical, but just because they're critical doesn't mean they're anti. And I think that's a key difference. Sometimes outside of China, we obsess over criticism of the Communist Party as sometimes we read it as something more than it is. That's what I'm saying. And that definitely happened in January. But since then, I think the Chinese response has been, after the initial cover-up, after the sluggish response, it's responded in a way that's been actually very efficient. It ultimately, in a country of 1.4 billion people, after locking down Hubei province, it's managed to, for the most part, reduce infections to that province, actually. So it's managed to isolate it to.
Just to give people a comparison, how many provinces, and these are the equivalent of states in China, are there?
So in China, well, there are, it depends, of course, who you are and how you define a Chinese province. I'm sure some people in the U.S. would not consider, say, Taiwan a province of China, but within China, that's obviously not the case. So it depends, but there are generally, China is divided into 23 provinces. And 22 provinces under the Chinese Communist Party, and then Taiwan is considered a 23rd province in China.
What lessons from China's experience do you think have been left out of mainstream Western media, but especially in the United States? There's been this effort to vilify China, but do you think China sees the United States in the same way, where there's this assumption of an enemy power, or do they approach international relations through a different mentality?
So the first part of that question, I think, what we can learn. I mean, once the decision was made around January the 20th by the Chinese Communist Party, the central leadership, the response was swift, decisive. And ultimately, it came down to mobilizing politics and putting politics in command at the expense of the market, at the expense of economic growth, which is extraordinary because in the West, we've been led to believe there's a general consensus that the Chinese Communist Party derives a lot of its legitimacy from economic growth. And its legitimacy came from the reforms in the late 1970s under Deng Xiaoping. And that's where it gets its legitimacy from. And the idea has been for a number of years that once that economic growth comes to an end, the Communist Party will lose its legitimacy. And, you know, some people believe that will result in chaos, upheaval, and possibly, I mean, I think it's more of a fantastical projection, the birth of possibly liberal democracy in China. So the decision to close down the economy effectively shows that the Communist Party, the leadership, has firmly been in command of this process. Politics were put in command, and hard decisions were made for sure. You know, people, you know, businesses have been lost, and, you know, the GDP figures came out yesterday, the worst since at least 1992, possibly since the Cultural Revolution. But ultimately, I do believe a decision was made at the top, and it was implemented both from the top and across Chinese society at a smaller level. And it's actually been incredibly beneficial to, one, getting this pandemic under control, and two, ultimately, reducing the market to a kind of a peripheral concern. The market has not figured in calculations, or it hadn't up until very recently, in the kind of the pandemic response from the Chinese government. And there's a lot of different ways that's played out. So, for example, many of China's biggest countries are state-owned in gas, oil, the banking sector, in high-end technology and stuff. And a lot of them were put. A lot of them also played a central role in the kind of pandemic response. So, obviously helping build and renovate hospitals around the country. Everybody read about the hospitals built in Hubei province in, you know, breakneck speed, but across China, many hospitals were also set up and renovated and improved by state-owned enterprises, which are state-owned. Of the production of medical equipment. So there was a shortage of masks for a couple of weeks at the beginning, but very, very, very quickly, key medical equipment, which nurses and doctors need in hospitals. A lot of production lines were switched to produce those things by state-owned companies. Testing kits also, food, so guaranteeing food supplies, grains, rice, and tech also, so things like artificial intelligence, 5G, cloud computing, big data. A lot of those things were put at the command of pandemic control.
It was possible because they had a system which was built where the state could actually dictate capital and dictate industry as opposed to the other way around. In the U.S., we have the opposite system. Capital and industry dictate our government. And Daniel, I'm sure this is especially interesting for you as a Westerner who's moved to China, and I'll get more into that question later. But I'm sure as you look back at the United States and Britain, where are you from? Are you?
I'm from Manchester in the UK.
So you're from the UK. So I'm sure you'll understand the sentiment I'm about to express. Why do you think so many people in the US and UK who are willing to question the mainstream media and the so-called deep state when it comes to Russiagate are unwilling to apply those same questions to China? There's this standard in the West even of giving the benefit of the doubt to Russia among certain political groups, but China is never afforded that same privilege. Why?
Dogmatism plays a role. I think, as people on the left, we need to be flexible in how we think. I have criticisms of the Chinese government, which I don't need to go into now. But being here the past few months has made as I've woken up to quite a few things, and the main thing is what you just said. The idea that the state and politics can be put in command when a population needs that, I think is something very, very different to what's playing out in Europe and certainly in the United States. And I think the left needs to engage with that. It's not, we need to engage with how China's responded to this. Yes, there were flaws, and yes, there was a sluggish response at the beginning, but I think it's actually been quite extraordinary up until this point. Of course, there's going to be pressures now. The economy needs to get up and running again. So there will be market pressures, but ultimately, this has happened because of the Chinese political system. The pandemic in China has happened pandemic control in China has happened because of the Chinese political system. There's been successes elsewhere. Vietnam, which happens to have a similar political system to China, the last time I checked, recorded 0 deaths. And of course, other countries like Singapore have had success for different reasons. But in China, I think the left needs to look at the evidence. It needs to look at how the Chinese state was able to get this under control, and ultimately how political will crushed the will of the market, actually, and has done that for a number of months. And that's, obviously the United States is the easy contrast, but that's ultimately saved, I think, tens of thousands of lives. For years, for decades, there was a belief, obviously, in the West that China would develop along Western lines. This was obviously especially prominent after the end of the Cold War, at the end of the Cold War, I should say, and even towards the end of the 1990s, and even in the 2000s. I think the ascension of Xi Jinping to becoming the leader of the Chinese Communist Party has kind of problematized that idea. And I think there's a belief now, there's an understanding, not a belief, an understanding now that actually China is going to chart its own independent direction. And whether you're positive and praiseworthy or critical of that, that's just how it's going to be. And it's not going to develop, it's not going to become a liberal democracy. It's not going to develop along Western lines. It will cooperate with the West on some issues, and it will not cooperate on the West on some issues. And I think that's triggered an existential crisis among Western political elites. I mean, obviously, Donald Trump is a personification of that crisis and those anxieties in a way, but it's happening not just in America, also in Britain too. There's been a lot of anti-China sentiment recently. It's very, very clear from the media, from, leading Conservative Party politicians. And we also have a think tank in the UK called the Henry Jackson Society, named after the Democrat, actually.
One of the most neoconservative think tanks in all of the UK.
Yeah, and, they've been publishing a number of anti-China papers over the past couple of years, including one recently about the coronavirus in China, where actually, it's an argument that China is responsible for all of the damages caused globally from the coronavirus. So all of the financial and stimulus packages introduced by Britain, by the G7 countries, amount to, at the moment, roughly $4 trillion US, and the Chinese Communist Party must pay that. And there should be a unified front in the West which demands they pay that. And it even like descends into conspiracy by suggesting that the Communist Party may have done this in a mendacious act of disruption to the global order. But yeah, these are this think tank has leeway in Parliament. Michael Gove is a signatory. He's a Conservative Party politician. Ian Duncan Smith, another influential Conservative Party member. He was one of the main opponents of the Huawei in the UK building 5G infrastructure. Just last year, he compared the Chinese Communist Party to Nazi Germany in Parliament. So this sentiment exists in the UK. I think there's probably lots of reasons for it, but I think one of them is an existential anxiety that China isn't going anywhere. It's not going to become like the West. And, Western political leaders have to deal with that. The Western intelligentsia does too.
Yeah.
Just the West.
So tell me, Daniel, why did you decide to move to China? Explain for viewers who might find it strange that a Westerner, a boy from Manchester, decided to pack up and move to Beijing.
I mean, I was always kind of interested in China, but in 2016, I was working for Telesur in Ecuador, Quito, and I started to read more actively around China. And about a year after that, I started to study Chinese, I guess. And yeah, so it wasn't like a lifelong plan or anything. As I became like more educated about the country, I just wanted to come here and learn more. And that's not stopped. So, I'm constantly reading about the country. I'm happy to be here. I'm learning from people here. It's a fascinating place. And I think another motivating factor was the fact that I think we need to learn more about China. The number of people studying Mandarin in the West is at dismal levels. And I'm not saying everybody should study Mandarin, but I feel like Chinese people know more about the West than many people than the West knows about China. And I think that's not helpful. And it's not helpful for political reasons too. So I think we do need people who have a good understanding of the country, who don't see it in binary black and white terms. And hopefully that happens. I'm not optimistic, especially in light of the geopolitical kind of, basically effectively a new Cold War, which was unfolding before the coronavirus and will probably be accelerated now, probably has already been accelerated, I should say. So, we need people, the left needs people who have a nuanced position of China and don't fall into that kind of thinking.
Certainly.
And, I like I said, I just want to emphasize as well, I do think many, at least in my experience in Beijing, many people here know more about the West than British people know about China. And I think that that's a hangover from times in the past that isn't really useful in the 21st century.
Well, Daniel, that's why I really appreciate you reaching out to me and having this conversation, coordinating with me, because it's so difficult to coordinate an interview actually from DC to Beijing because of the time difference. So I appreciate your patience there. Where can viewers follow your work?
Well, at the moment, I'm not actually producing anything in print, so I'm working in broadcast. But I have an article coming out soon, which will be about some of the things we spoke about, in particular the Henry Jackson Society, and the kind of role that's playing in kind of producing this anti-China sentiment, both in the British media and in British politics more generally.